There are two peoples whose names you almost never hear spoken in the same breath, without a wall of history rising up between them. You know the divide. It is old, it is real, and it has shaped maps, headlines, and lifetimes. And somewhere underneath all of it, most of us carry a quiet assumption we've never actually examined, that a divide that deep must go all the way down. That two peoples kept apart for so long, by so much, must be, at some level, different kinds of people. I want to set that assumption down for the next 20 minutes. Not argue with it, just set it down, and ask a narrower question. A question that has nothing to do with borders or politics or who was where and when. If you took the DNA of these two peoples, and you read it the way a geneticist reads it, no flags, no history, just the letters themselves, how far apart would the code actually place them? Because that question has an answer. It was answered, carefully, in a peer-reviewed study more than 2 decades ago. And the answer is not the one the wall of history would lead you to expect. If you stay with me to the end of this, you'll come away understanding something about ancestry that most people, on every side of every divide like this one, get exactly backwards. That's the whole reason to be here. So before we go further, if this is the kind of thing you find worth thinking about, consider subscribing. It genuinely helps this channel keep making these. Now, to understand why the answer is surprising, we first need to understand what we're actually reading when we read someone's DNA. Every human alive today descends from a small population that lived in Africa. Everyone. When we walked out of that continent and spread across the planet, we carried the same book with us and only ever edited it in the margins. Compare any two people anywhere on Earth. A farmer in the Andes, a fisherman in the Baltic, a child in the Levant, and their DNA is something like 99.9% identical. The differences between human groups are real, but they are written in that final sliver. They are edits in the margin of a book everyone shares. And within that sliver, one stretch of the code is especially useful for tracing where people came from. It's the Y-chromosome, the piece passed down, almost unchanged, from father to son, generation after generation. Almost unchanged. Every so often, a tiny copying error slips in, harmless, permanent, and it gets passed down along with everything else. Those little errors accumulate down the male line like notches carved into a walking stick handed from father to son. Read the notches, and you can follow a paternal lineage back through thousands of years. Geneticists group those lineages into branches called haplogroups, the big, ancient boughs of the paternal tree. But you can zoom in further. Within a haplogroup, the finer pattern of notches, the exact combination a given man carries, is called his haplotype. Think of the haplogroup as the surname and the haplotype as the specific branch of the family. Two men in the same haplogroup are distant cousins on the male line. Two men with nearly identical haplotypes are close ones. That distinction, bough versus twig, is exactly the tool that lets you measure not just whether two peoples are related, but how closely. And this is where the study we're talking about begins. In 2001, a team led by the geneticist Almut Nebel published a paper in the American Journal of Human Genetics with a deliberately quiet title: The Y-chromosome Pool of Jews as Part of the Genetic Landscape of the Middle East. Read that title again slowly, because the argument is hiding right there in the phrasing. Not apart from the landscape, part of it. So let's walk through what they actually found, not as a verdict, but as a set of pieces that only make sense when you lay them side by side. And there's one idea I'm going to keep coming back to, because everything here bends toward it. Ancestry is not a line, it's a web. Think of it less as a single thread drawn back through time, and more as a braided river, channels splitting apart and rejoining across a wide plain, all of them carrying water from the same source. Hold on to that river. We'll come back to it. Here's the first piece. Across the Levant, the strip of land at the eastern end of the Mediterranean, there is one paternal branch that dominates almost everything. It's called haplogroup J. If you sample the men of this region, you keep hitting it. J and its subbranches over and over. By the ordinary rules, you might expect two peoples who define themselves in opposition to each other to sit on different branches, different origins, different lineages, a genetic version of the wall. That would be the tidy story. It isn't what the code says. Both peoples, Jewish populations and Palestinian Arab populations alike, are dominated by that same haplogroup J, the same deep paternal branch. Not neighboring branches, the same one. And J isn't a modern arrival. It's an ancient Levantine and Near Eastern lineage, threaded through the whole region long before any of the identities we argue about today existed. It comes in two great subbranches that geneticists label J1 and J2, one associated more with the deserts and the Semitic-speaking peoples of the Near East, the other with the early farmers who spread out of the Fertile Crescent as agriculture was born. Both branches run through both peoples. The mechanism here isn't complicated. It's simply that both peoples drew their fathers, overwhelmingly, from the same very old regional pool, the same two boughs of the same ancient tree. Now, what that does prove is narrow, and I want to be honest about it. It tells us these two groups share a dominant paternal ancestry. What it does not prove is anything about worth or purity or who was first. It's a statement about where the lineages came from, nothing more and nothing less. Origin, not ranking. Keep that line clean because it's easy to smudge. And it carries us straight into the next piece. Because sharing a branch is one thing. How close on that branch is another. So here's the second piece, and it's the heart of the study. Nebel's team didn't just note that both groups carried haplogroup J. They compared the fine detail, the specific haplotypes, the exact pattern of those accumulated notches, across Jewish communities and across the non-Jewish peoples of the Middle East. And then they asked the real question. When you lay all these populations out by genetic distance, who ends up standing next to whom? To put what they were doing in perspective, picture a map, but not a map of land, a map of similarity. Each population gets a position, and the rule is simple. The more alike two peoples are on the paternal line, the closer together they sit. Peoples with deeply different ancestries land far apart, on opposite sides of the sheet. Peoples cut from the same cloth cluster into a tight knot. It's a way of letting the DNA itself decide who belongs near whom, with every political label stripped off the page. By the usual expectation, you might think Jewish communities, after centuries of living in Europe, in North Africa, in Central Asia, would have drifted toward their host populations. That 2,000 years of separation would show up as 2,000 years of distance. There's a real reason to expect that. Live among a population for 60 generations, marry across the line here and there each generation, and the signal should blur. Given enough time, you'd expect a European Jewish community to slide across that map of similarity until it sat beside other Europeans, and a Jewish community in the Caucasus to drift toward its mountain neighbors, each one slowly absorbed into the place it lived. That is not where they landed. When the populations were arranged by their paternal genetics, Jewish communities, Ashkenazi from Europe, Sephardic from the Mediterranean, Kurdish Jews from the mountains of the north, clustered together with the non-Jewish populations of the Middle East. And among the closest of those neighbors were Palestinian Arabs and the Bedouin. Read purely on the male line, a Palestinian and a Jew were, on average, close relatives in the genetic sense, sharing a large fraction of the very same haplotypes. Sit with the strangeness of that for a moment. Two peoples who, in the public imagination, sit on opposite sides of one of the world's hardest divides. And when you strip the story down to the notches on the walking stick, they keep resolving into the same extended family. The mechanism is the braided river again. Go back far enough, into the Bronze Age of the Levant, into the shared world of the ancient Near East, and the ancestors of both peoples are drinking from the same channel. What we call Jewish and Palestinian today are two channels that separated downstream, but the water is the same water. That's the finding. Not a metaphor imposed on the data, the shape the data actually took. But that finding raises a hard question of its own, and a good skeptic should be asking it right now. If Jewish communities were scattered across 3 continents for the better part of 2,000 years, why wasn't that shared signal simply washed away? How does a paternal lineage survive that much time, that much distance? Part of the answer is that the male line is stubborn by nature. It passes down largely intact, so a founding set of paternal lineages can echo forward for a very long time. And part of it is history. For long stretches, many of these communities married largely within themselves, not as a matter of superiority, but as the ordinary reality of tight-knit groups holding on to an identity in scattered places. That pattern acts like a preservative. It keeps the founding signal legible across centuries, which is exactly why, when Nebel's team went looking 2 millennia later, the old Levantine root was still there to be read. The layers piled on top, but they never buried it. Which raises the obvious question: if the shared root runs that deep, where do the differences come from? Because there are differences. This is where most people go wrong, so let's do it carefully. Here's the third piece. The differences between these two peoples on the genetic level are real, but they are not different roots. They are later layers added on top of a shared one. And that distinction is the whole ballgame. Think about what happened to each group after that shared Bronze Age starting point. The peoples who became today's Palestinians stayed largely rooted in the Levant, and over the centuries received gene flow from later movements through the region, including, after the Arab expansion of the 7th century, some paternal lineages tracing to the Arabian Peninsula, and a smaller component with deeper African connections carried along the long web of trade and migration that ran through this crossroads. Nebel's team could actually see those later arrivals in the data, distinct threads laid over the older Levantine base. And the Jewish communities? They carried that same Levantine base out into the diaspora and picked up their own later layers. Ashkenazi paternal lines, for instance, show a measurable European contribution, absorbed over centuries of life in Europe, sitting on top of the Middle Eastern foundation. So look at what that actually means. Palestinian, Ashkenazi. Each one is the shared Levantine root, plus a different set of later overlays. Same foundation, different additions. It is not 2 houses built on 2 plots of land. It is one foundation with 2 families who each renovated over the centuries. The trade-off, to be honest about, those overlays are real, and they're not nothing. They're centuries of distinct history written into the code. But they are additions to a shared base, not evidence of separate origins. The differences are the renovations. The kinship is the foundation. And that reframes everything the wall of history tells us. The divide between these peoples is enormous, but it was built by history, by conquest, by displacement, by faith and language and the accidents of who ended up where. It was not written into the blood. The genome didn't build the wall. People did. There's a fourth piece worth touching, gently, because it's often waved around in these conversations and it deserves care. You may have heard of something called the Cohen Modal Haplotype. The often told story of how it was found is worth a minute because it shows you exactly the kind of thing this branch of science can and can't do. In the mid-1990s, a physician and researcher named Karl Skorecki was sitting in synagogue, himself part of the Kohanim, the traditional priestly line. He watched another man called up for the same priestly honor, a man from a completely different corner of the Jewish world, whose family had spent centuries somewhere entirely different from Skorecki's own. And a thought caught him. By tradition, every Cohen is supposed to descend, father to son, from a single ancestor thousands of years back. If that oral claim were literally true, if it were more than a story, then he and this stranger, despite two utterly different recent histories, ought to carry the same signature on their Y chromosome. It was, suddenly, a claim you could test. He took the question to the geneticist Michael Hammer, and they ran it. And the tradition, in broad strokes, held up. Working through the late 1990s, Skorecki, Hammer, Mark Thomas, and others found that a particular Y chromosome pattern, the one that came to be called the Cohen Modal Haplotype, appeared at unusually high frequency among men who identified as Kohanim, far more often than among other Jewish men. It was striking evidence of genuine paternal continuity, a specific lineage tracked across an enormous stretch of time, holding together the way the tradition said it should. But here's what matters for us, and it's easy to miss. That priestly haplotype sits inside, you guessed it, haplogroup J, the same deep Levantine branch we've been following the whole way. Even the lineage that looks, at first glance, like the most exclusive, most set-apart story you could tell, resolves, when you follow it down, into the shared regional root. The web again. Every thread you pull leads back toward the same source. And I want to be clear about what that continuity is and isn't. It's a beautiful example of persistence, a lineage that endured, that held its shape across thousands of years and enormous upheaval. That's a real and moving thing. It is not a claim that one lineage is purer or older or better than another. Persistence is not superiority. A lineage that survived is telling you it survived, not that it won. So let's pull the last piece into place. Why? Why should a region this contested have a genetic history this shared? And the answer is almost embarrassingly simple once you see it. Geography. The Levant is a corridor. It's the narrow bridge of land where Africa, Asia, and Europe press up against one another. The place every migration, every army, every trade route had to pass through to get anywhere else. Run the list of who came through, and you start to feel the weight of it. Canaanites and Egyptians, Assyrians and Babylonians and Persians, Greeks under Alexander, then Rome, then the armies of the early Islamic expansion, Crusaders and the Ottomans after them. Some of them ruled for centuries, some passed through in a season. But almost none of them left without leaving a little of themselves behind in the population. A few more threads woven into the same cloth. For tens of thousands of years, people moved through this ground, settled it, mixed on it, were conquered and absorbed and displaced and replaced on it, over and over. Some arrivals were absorbed. Some of the older population was pushed out. Some simply stayed and blended into whoever came next. A crossroads that busy doesn't produce neatly separated peoples. It produces a braided river. Channels forever splitting and rejoining, carrying the same water down the same plain. The peoples living on that ground today are not the descendants of separate arrivals who happen to end up neighbors. They are, in the deepest genetic sense the male line can show us, branches of one long-rooted population that a crossroads geography kept mixing for millennia. The wall is recent. The kinship is ancient. Now let me pull all of this up to the level it actually lives at. What Nebel's 2001 study found, and what the haplogroup story around it shows, is not a political statement, and it was never meant as one. It's a description of a paternal genetic landscape, and in that landscape, Jewish and Palestinian populations are not distant. They are among the closest of neighbors, drawn from a common Levantine pool, differentiated by later history rather than by separate origin. And I want to be careful and honest about the reach of that, because honesty is the whole point of doing this properly. This is largely the story of the Y chromosome, the paternal line specifically. It is one powerful thread through a much larger tapestry, not the entire cloth. The maternal line, traced through a different piece of the code, can tell its own story, and sometimes a more mixed one. In some Jewish communities, the mother's lineages show much deeper local, regional roots in the places the diaspora settled. Ancestry is never a single measurement, and honesty means saying so. But on the measurement this study made, the deep paternal record of two peoples, the reading is clear, and it points the same direction the geography always suggested. So here's the thing most people get backwards, the thing I promised you at the start. We tend to assume that the size of a divide tells us something about the depth of a difference, that peoples this separated must be separated all the way down. The genetics says the opposite. The divide is at the surface, real, painful, historical, human. And underneath it runs a shared root that no amount of history managed to sever. Think about what that means for a moment. Somewhere in the accumulated notches on that walking stick, the one handed down father to son across 4,000 years, a Palestinian and a Jew, following their own lines back, would meet. Not in theory, in the data. The line doesn't end at a wall. It braids back into the same river. And if you've ever taken one of those ancestry tests and puzzled over the small, unexpected percentages, a sliver of somewhere you didn't think you were from, this is part of why. None of us is a single line drawn cleanly backward. Every one of us is a web, a confluence, a braided river of people who moved and met and mixed across a planet that never stopped rearranging them. That's not a weakness in the story of who you are. It is the story. So the next time that wall of history rises up between two names, and it will, it's worth remembering what sits underneath it. Not two different kinds of people. Two channels of one old river running under all of it, carrying the same water it always did, from the same source toward the same sea. Thank you for staying with this one all the way to the end.